He said it the way you say something true before your brain catches up to your mouth. Whoever marries you is going to be one lucky man. He meant it as a compliment. The kind you offer someone you respect, like saying the food was wonderful or you did a fine job. Clean, honest, no risk attached. He expected her to smile, maybe wave it off, go back to what she was doing. She didn't. She went completely still, not the frozen kind, the quiet kind, the kind of stillness that means something is happening underneath. And then she turned and looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not once in all the years he'd known her, and she said softly, like it cost her something to say it, "I was hoping it would be you." And the whole world just kept going. The water moved. A bird crossed above them. The wind came through the trees the way it always did, not caring at all that something enormous had just happened on the bank of that creek. This is the story of Thomas Calloway, a man who spent years looking directly at something beautiful without truly seeing it, and the woman who waited, not out of weakness, but out of the particular kind of courage that most people will never understand, the courage to love someone quietly, without guarantee, without complaint, until the moment finally came when honest words could be spoken. And when that moment came, she didn't flinch. Thomas was 30 years old when this story finds him working a modest cattle operation on the western edge of a small Colorado town called Harrow Creek. The land there was beautiful the way hard things often are. Not soft or welcoming, but enormous and honest. Big sky, cold winters, summers that arrived fast and left without apologizing. You had to earn a life there. You had to want it. Thomas wanted it. He had grown up on that land, buried his father in it, and decided somewhere along the way that he would stay. Not because he had no other options, but because leaving felt like betrayal of something he couldn't name. He was a man other people trusted. Not because he was charming, he wasn't particularly, but because he was consistent. He said what he meant. He did what he said. He showed up when it mattered and didn't expect applause for it. In a place like Harrow Creek, that kind of man was worth knowing. What Thomas did not have, what he had quietly, almost invisibly stopped reaching for, was someone to share it with. He wasn't bitter about it. He wasn't even sad in any way he would have admitted. He had just gradually stopped leaving a space open, stopped letting himself want it directly, because wanting directly, he had learned the hard way, meant that losing directly was always possible. And he had already lost enough to know what that kind of pain cost. His father, his mother, 2 years after. A younger brother who had moved west and written letters less and less until the letters stopped entirely. Loss had shaped him slowly, the way weather shapes stone, not breaking it, just rounding off the sharp edges until nothing could quite cut him anymore, including hope. He lived alone, he worked. He was fine. Fine, as everyone who has ever been fine knows, is the most deceptive word in the English language. The Whitfield family lived on the neighboring property to the north. Marcus and Eleanor Whitfield and their daughter, Nora. Thomas had known the Whitfields for 7 years. He had helped Marcus repair a collapsed barn wall after a bad winter. He had eaten Eleanor's cooking more times than he could count, always good, always more than enough. He liked them. They were the kind of neighbors who made a difficult life feel less solitary. Nora Whitfield was 25. She woke before sunrise. She managed the house, kept the garden productive through the short growing season, cooked, mended, hauled water, and somehow also found time to teach reading to 2 younger families in the area whose children had no other access to schooling. She did all of this without drawing attention to it, without waiting to be thanked. She moved through her days with the quiet efficiency of someone who has decided that the work itself is the point, not the recognition of it. Thomas had known her for all 7 of those years. He had spoken to her dozens of times. He had watched her work. He had thought vaguely that Marcus and Eleanor had raised a remarkable young woman. What he had not done, not until a particular Tuesday afternoon in late summer, was actually see her. There is a difference between looking at something every day and truly seeing it. We all know this. We drive the same road for years, and then one morning the light hits differently, and we notice a hill we somehow never registered. We live with people for decades, and then something shifts, a word, a gesture, an unguarded moment, and suddenly we understand something about them. We had been standing right next to the whole time. That is what happened to Thomas Calloway at that creek. He had been repairing the fence along the property line when Nora came down to the water with her washing. The creek there ran through a stand of cottonwoods, wide and shallow and cold, even in summer, and it was the kind of spot that made you feel briefly that the world was manageable. She didn't see him at first. She set her basket down and began working, sleeves rolled up, hair loosely pinned, humming something low to herself. Not for anyone, just humming because the morning was good and the work was simple, and she was the kind of person who made music out of ordinary moments without realizing she was doing it. He kept working. He told himself he was keeping working. They talked when she noticed him. Nothing significant. The weather, the cattle prices, whether the creek would run high again before autumn. Easy conversation between people who have been neighbors long enough to skip the formal parts. Then she went back to her washing, and he went back to his fence, and the water moved between them. He drove a post into the ground and thought, for the first time in a very long time, that he was not entirely alone. He didn't know what to do with that thought, so he filed it somewhere and went back to work. Harrow Creek held its annual summer gathering on the last Saturday of July. It was the kind of event that small communities depend on more than they realize, a chance to see each other, to remember that they're not each fighting the land entirely on their own. Old fiddle players, long tables covered in more food than anyone could reasonably consume, children running in directions that worried their parents, and all the complicated social business that gets conducted between people who only have a few chances a year to be in the same place. Thomas arrived to find the Whitfields already there. Marcus in his good jacket, Eleanor with the particular dignity she carried everywhere, and Nora in a pale green dress, simple and clean, already helping with something, already making herself useful because that was simply who she was. 3 different men asked her to dance before the first song was finished. Thomas watched this from across the yard with an expression that he would have described, if asked, as nothing in particular. He danced once with the widow Hargrove, who was a good dancer and a direct woman, and who told him, about halfway through the song, that he had been watching Nora Whitfield since he arrived. "I haven't been watching her," he said. She gave him the specific look that experienced women give men who are not yet ready to be honest with themselves. "Thomas," she said, "I have watched you for 6 years. You've been watching her." He changed the subject. He was good at changing subjects. But walking home that night under a sky so thick with stars, it felt almost excessive. He thought about what the widow Hargrove had said, and for the first time he stopped fighting it and just let himself look at the thought directly. He stopped in the middle of the road. He stood there in the dark, the crickets going, the mountains just visible against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky, and understood something that had apparently been true for quite a while without his permission. He wanted to see Nora Whitfield every day, not as a neighbor, not as a family friend. Every day, specifically with intention, with the full weight of what that actually meant. He stood there for a while. Then he walked home carefully, the way you move when you're carrying something fragile. August brought a stretch of particularly harsh heat, and old Mr. Hadley down the road, a bachelor in his 70s with a bad knee and no family nearby, struggled more than usual. Nora had been bringing him meals twice a week since spring. Thomas found this out by accident when he saw her on the road with a covered basket, walking the half-mile to Hadley's place in the full sun of mid-morning. He didn't think about it. He climbed down from the shed roof he'd been patching, dusted off his hands, and walked to the road. "I'll walk with you," he said. She looked at him with a slightly surprised expression that she smoothed over quickly. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." That walk taught him something that 7 years of neighborly proximity had somehow failed to. Nora Whitfield was extraordinary company. She had opinions. Quiet ones, thoughtful ones, offered gently and without any pressure for you to agree. She noticed things he would have walked right past. The way the bank on the north side of the Second Creek crossing was undercutting, which would matter in spring. The Henderson family's corn coming in thin, what that would mean for their winter. She saw the landscape not just as scenery but as information, the way people do when they've been paying close attention for a long time. She was also, in a completely understated way, funny. The dry kind of funny that doesn't announce itself. That catches you off guard. That makes you laugh before you realize you were going to. At Hadley's place, she heated the meal, checked his firewood supply, and listened patiently while the old man talked for 40 minutes about things that had happened to him in the 1840s. Hadley was not a man who worried much about social graces. He looked at Thomas at one point and said, plainly in front of Nora, "You'd be a fool not to see what's right in front of you, son." Nora found something very urgent to attend to in the kitchen. Thomas looked at the old man. "I'm working on it," he said quietly. Hadley made a sound that meant something like about time. On the walk back, neither of them mentioned what Hadley had said. The silence between them had changed, though it wasn't empty the way silence between near strangers can be. It was warm. It was full of things not quite ready to be spoken yet, but present, acknowledged somehow by both of them. At the fork in the road where their paths divided, Nora turned to him. "Thank you for the company," she said, and then with that particular directness of hers, "It's better with someone to walk with." He watched her go and thought, "Yes, it is." He went home and thought about that sentence for 3 days. It was a Tuesday again. He had started to notice that Tuesdays seemed to matter more than other days, though he couldn't entirely explain why. He was checking the repaired fence sections when he heard her at the creek. The larger washing this time, which she was working through with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. And she was singing, not performing. Just singing the way people do when they think no one is listening, low and easy and entirely unself-conscious, the way a person breathes when they've forgotten to be watched. He stood there longer than he should have. The blue sky above the cottonwoods, the sound of the water, Nora Whitfield doing an ordinary thing with a grace she clearly had no idea she possessed. And he was thinking about Hadley, about the widow Hargrove, about the road in July, about everything he had been slowly, reluctantly, honestly coming to understand about himself. She noticed him and raised a hand. He walked to the fence. They talked about the usual things, the weather, the cattle, whether the Henderson family's harvest would hold. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that means you don't have to fill every space to make the other person feel valued. He was watching her wring water from a shirt, her hands strong and sure, completely unguarded in the way people are when they trust where they are. And something came up out of him that he hadn't planned and hadn't prepared, and certainly hadn't consulted his better judgment about. "Nora," he said, "whoever ends up marrying you is going to be a very lucky man." He meant it as a true thing, an honest observation. He expected a modest deflection, a laugh, a graceful sidestep that would let both of them move on without anyone having to be particularly brave. Instead, she went still. Her hands stayed on the shirt. Something moved across her face, slow and quiet as a cloud shadow moving across a field. The color came into her cheeks gradually, not dramatically, just a deepening, like turning up a lamp. She didn't look at him immediately. Then she did, and her expression was something he had never seen on her before. Open and afraid and decided all at once. The face of someone who has been carrying something in private for a long time and has just decided, here, now that they're done carrying it alone. She said very quietly, "I was hoping it would be you." The creek kept moving. A hawk went across the sky. The cottonwoods shifted in the wind the way they always did, indifferent and faithful, because they had no idea something enormous had just happened on their bank. Thomas stood on his side of the fence and understood, fully and without any remaining ambiguity, that something had changed between them that could not be put back. He stood there and searched himself honestly, and found that he did not want it put back. "Nora," he said, and then, because he was a man who had always preferred plain speech, "I meant what I said." She was still looking at him. "I know you did," she said. "That's why I said what I said." She set the shirt down carefully, picked it back up, set it down again, then looked at him steadily and said, "I've been thinking about you since that walk to Hadley's. Before that, probably. I just hadn't been honest with myself yet." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about you for considerably longer than that." "How much longer?" she asked. There was a small, dry note in her voice, that particular humor of hers showing up even here. "Longer than I'm comfortable admitting," he said. She laughed. Genuine, surprised. The kind of laugh that happens when you're relieved. "Well," she said, "you got here? I'm sorry it took me so long." "Don't apologize," she said, and something in her voice made clear that she meant it. "You got there. That's what matters." They stood on opposite sides of a fence in the summer heat, and Thomas Calloway thought about how strange it is, how a person can be right there, close enough to speak to every week for years, and how long it can take to actually see them, to really see them. Not as a neighbor or a friend's daughter or a woman you admire in a general way, but as someone specific, the one specific person you actually want. "Would you allow me to come call on you properly?" he said. "I'd like to speak with your father." She picked up her basket, held it against her hip, looked at him for a moment. "He likes you," she said. "He's been waiting for you to figure this out for about 2 years." She walked back toward the Whitfield house. Thomas stood at the fence for a long time after she was out of sight, feeling like a man who has just realized how close he came to missing the most important thing in his life. He went the next evening. Clean shirt, combed hair, more nervous than he'd been since the winter. He was 19 and had to tell his father he'd lost 3 head of cattle in a blizzard. Marcus Whitfield was sitting on the porch when Thomas arrived. He had a cup of coffee and the unhurried manner of a man who had been expecting company. They sat looking at the mountains until the silence felt ready for conversation. "I'd like to come calling on Nora," Thomas said. "With your permission." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He took a sip of his coffee. Then he looked at Thomas with the steady gaze of a man who chose his words carefully because he understood their weight. "What took you so long?" he said. Not unkindly, sincerely. Thomas met his eyes. "I'm a slow learner about some things." "You're careful," Marcus said. "That's not a character flaw, but Nora has been patient." He paused. "She doesn't ask for things she doesn't need, never has, but she deserves a man who sees her for what she actually is. Not what's convenient to see, what she actually is." "I see her," Thomas said, quietly, without performance. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Once. The way men do when they've decided something. Supper is at 6 most evenings," he said. "Eleanor sets a good table." He had supper with the Whitfields 4 times that week. On the 4th evening, he and Nora walked to the edge of the north pasture and stood in the fading light and talked the way you can only talk with someone you've stopped performing for. They talked about the land and the future and small things that turned out not to be small. What they believed about hard seasons. What they thought a good life actually required. "Are you happy here?" he asked. "With this kind of life?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. "I think happiness isn't something you find," she said. "I think it's something you build." People who spend their lives looking for it somewhere else usually walk right past what they already have. She looked at him. "What about you?" "I think," he said carefully, "that I'm getting a great deal happier." She smiled and looked away at the mountains, and he understood that she understood. October came in cold and golden. The courtship happened in the margins of working lives because that is where real things happen. Supper evenings, Sunday afternoons, walks along the creek and back. He brought her wildflowers from the high pasture, not bought ones, just the ones he noticed and thought she'd like. She pressed them without making a ceremony of it. He helped her learn a new bread recipe. She was patient with his failures, which were numerous. He got better. She told him he was easy to be patient with, which was the sort of thing she said sideways without looking directly at him, that he found himself thinking about for days. He fixed the sticking gate on the Whitfield property without mentioning it. Marcus mentioned it 2 weeks later with a handshake that carried more meaning than the words. And then one night in mid-October, something happened that Thomas never told Nora about. He was crossing the dark field toward the Whitfield house, the lights warm and steady in the windows ahead of him, and he stopped, not because anything was wrong, because something was right. So completely right that it frightened him in a way that problems never quite could. He stood in that dark field and understood what he was walking toward. Not just supper, not just Nora, the wanting itself, the real kind, the kind that could be taken away. He had built walls against this for years, not out of weakness, but out of experience. He knew what loss cost. He had paid that price, and the walls had worked. Nothing had gotten through because he had stopped leaving doors open. He stood there in the cold for 10 full minutes, then he walked forward anyway. Nora heard him coming across the field before he knocked, the way she always did, and opened the door and said, "You're late. The biscuits are cold." And he stepped inside into warmth and lamplight and the smell of Eleanor's cooking, and he looked at Nora and thought quietly and with his full heart, "This is what I almost closed myself off from." He asked her in November, back at the creek, back at the fence, because that was where the true things had been said, and it seemed right to return. The cottonwoods had gone gold and were dropping their leaves one or two at a time, indifferent to the occasion. The air had the first real cold of autumn in it. Nora had a shawl around her shoulders. Thomas had his mother's ring in his coat pocket, a plain silver band with a small inset stone, and he had been carrying it for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. He had finally understood that the right moment was not something that appeared. It was something you decided. "Nora," he said. She turned. "I know I was slow," he said. "I know I took longer than I should have to understand what was right in front of me, but I understand it now. I see you clearly. Every day I see you, and I want to keep seeing you clearly every single day for the rest of my life. I want to build something real with you. A home, a family, a life we make on purpose together. I would be honored if you would marry me." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. The smile on her face was not the polished kind. It was the kind that has nowhere to hide because it doesn't want to hide anywhere. "Thomas Calloway," she said. "It took you long enough. Is that a yes?" "That," she said, "is absolutely a yes." He put his mother's ring on her finger by the creek under the gold cottonwoods, and she looked at it for a moment with an expression that was not about the ring, but about everything the ring meant. Then she looked up at him, and he kissed her for the first time. And the creek moved past them the way it always had, the way it always would, faithful and indifferent, and the cottonwoods let go of a few more leaves into the November air as if the world intended to keep going, which it did. That winter was the richest of Thomas's life, not because it was easy, ranch winters never were, but because there was supper and conversation and someone to walk home beside in the cold, and the knowledge, solid and warm as banked coals, that spring was already decided. He rebuilt things that winter. The kitchen floor, entirely. A second window on the east wall of the main room, so the morning light would come through when she was making coffee. He didn't tell her, he just did it, in the dark of winter before she was there, because the house would be hers too. When Eleanor Whitfield heard the news, she held Nora's hands and looked at the ring and then at Thomas, and said quietly and with complete certainty, "I always knew it would be you." Marcus shook his hand with both of his. Old Hadley told the following week, looked Thomas dead in the eye and said, "Huh, finally." The same word Thomas would later count, that 7 different people used. In February, Nora came to look at the ranch house with her mother to plan where things would go. She stood in the kitchen and saw the east window and the morning light coming through it in long gold angles across the floor, and she went quiet. "You did this without telling me," she said. "I did." "Why the east window?" "So you'd have the morning light," he said. "I know you like the mornings." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she walked across the kitchen and took his hand and held it the way you hold something you intend to keep. She didn't say anything dramatic. She said, "Thank you." 2 words. No performance. He understood that she was not thanking him for the window. She was thanking him for what the window meant, that in the dark of winter before she arrived, he had already been thinking about her mornings, had already made something ready for her, had already, without knowing how to say it, pointed the house toward the direction of the life he wanted to share with her. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't make speeches. It just quietly faces east. The wedding was on a Saturday in April, when the hills were green, and the sky was the particular blue that follows a long rain. Half of Harrow Creek came. Nora wore a dress her mother had spent the winter making. Simple ivory cotton, careful work at the collar. She walked toward Thomas with her father's arm in hers and her face entirely clear, and he stood there thinking, "I cannot believe I was slow about this." They said their vows plainly, because that was how both of them preferred things. Marcus Whitfield's voice broke slightly when asked who gave his daughter, which started something quiet and sympathetic going through several rows of the gathering. Thomas said his vows looking directly at Nora, not at the crowd. She said hers the same way. And then they were married. The fiddle played until the stars came out. The food lasted until there was none left. Children ran themselves to exhaustion and were carried home by their parents. That night, in the ranch house with the east window and the new floor, Nora sat at the kitchen table with her hair down and her hands around a cup of tea and looked at Thomas across the table with an expression that was entirely new, something permanent and decided, and said, "We're going to be very happy here." "I know," he said. "You were slower than me," she said, and there was a smile at the edge of it. "I was," he said, "but I got here." "You got here," she agreed. The years that came were built from ordinary days, done honestly. The ranch grew. Their family grew, a son first, then a daughter. They argued occasionally, the way people do when they both have opinions, and resolved it the way people do when they're actually on the same side. Nora organized a supply-sharing system among the families in the area that people would still be talking about a generation later, though she never described it as anything more than practical. On a Tuesday evening in the autumn of their 5th year, Thomas was at the creek fence when Nora came down with both children. She saw him and raised her hand. He climbed the fence. Later, when the children had worn themselves down and were leaning against their parents in the last of the afternoon light, Nora rested her head against his shoulder. "I've been thinking," she said, "about that day at the creek. What you said. Whoever marries you will be lucky," he said. "You were right," she said. "She is very lucky." He looked at her. "I'm the lucky one," she considered this. "We're both lucky," she said, in that practical way of hers. "We're both lucky," he agreed. The cottonwoods had gone gold again, October being October. The mountains held the last light on their peaks, and Thomas Calloway held his family in the fading afternoon and understood, with the full weight of a man who knows what things cost, what he had almost convinced himself he didn't deserve, what he had nearly closed himself off from, post by post, wall by wall, winter by winter. He was grateful in a way that went all the way down, slower than he should have been. But there, right where he was supposed to be, there's something worth sitting with in this story. Thomas wasn't afraid of hard work. He wasn't afraid of loss, exactly. He had survived it already. What he was afraid of, without knowing he was afraid of it, was wanting something real and losing it. So he had quietly, over years, gotten very good at not wanting things directly, at keeping the door closed, at being fine. Most of us recognize that. We've all built some version of that wall. And Nora had known for years. She carried it without bitterness, without performing it, without making it anyone else's burden. She went about her days fully, completely, genuinely, and she waited, not passively, not desperately, but with the dignified patience of someone who knows her own worth well enough not to force someone else to see it before they're ready. And when the moment came, she answered honestly. When she could have deflected, when deflection would have been so much safer, she said the true thing. That is not a small thing. That took more courage than anything Thomas did. They both chose the honest thing when it mattered. And from one moment at a creek in Colorado, with a shirt and a fence post and words that arrived before good judgment could stop them, everything else followed. The greatest things in your life are rarely hidden from you. They are usually right there, close enough to speak to, close enough that you have somehow stopped seeing them clearly. Don't wait 7 years. Look up. Look honestly. Say the true thing when it arrives. You might just find that they were hoping it would be you all along.